Good day, 1D, and welcome to our first remote onlining class, and hope everybody's doing well, and kind of connecting the topic that we were covering in class before we left, looking at what is the role of the church in the state, and we're beginning to see that even play out today. What's the role of the government, to keep people safe? What is the role of the church in this, to be a good citizen? And we were covering back when Constantine gave Christianity official status. Prior to that, we basically were underground. We had celebrations of Eucharist in people's homes. We could be persecuted for our faith. And suddenly we were thrust into the limelight. Constantine gave us legal status. Constantine gave clergy special elite status. He made bishops judges. He gave us basilicas to use as churches. He gave the Pope his Lateran palace. And suddenly Christianity becomes much more acceptable. And even in 380, Theodosius makes it the official religion of the empire. And then we got all these talented, great leaders who become bishops, who help organize the church, so much so that we survive the barbarian invasions that the Roman Empire doesn't. And together, if you remember, we had that alliance between the papacy and the Frankish monarchs, beginning with Clovis, then going with Pepin, culminating in Charlemagne, that the church and state could create something we call Christendom. A society permeated with Christian values, Christian beliefs. And Charlemagne took this seriously. Remember, reforming education, trying from priests to be literate, and that everybody should receive some sort of catechetical training. But then his sons didn't do so well. And remember, we looked at this clash between popes and emperors. And if you look at one of the slides I put there in the PowerPoint, it's by Richard Labelle. It says the church became involved in the world so that it might spiritualize the secular realm. But a frequent result is that the spiritual realm became secularized. Think about that for a few minutes there. The church became involved in the world so it might spiritualize the secular realm. But a frequent result is the spiritual realm became secularized. I hope you can hear St. Augustine, City of God there. It's our duty, it's our obligation, our responsibility to change the city of man into the city of God. But we saw great power comes great responsibility, and power can corrupt. And unfortunately, the church was not immune to this corruption. And I'd like to use one of the stories. It's kind of a funny papal story. Pope Formosus was Pope from 891 to 896. And after his death, he was not really well liked. Formosus means good-looking pope, but they decided to hold a trial for him posthumously, and it was called the Cadaver Synod. They actually exhume his body, dress him in his papal garments, sit him on his throne, and they have a trial. And surprisingly, he was unable to defend himself and therefore declared guilty. So all his acts as pope were declared null and void. And to symbolize that, remember the power of symbolism, they decided to cut off the 3 fingers, which would have been giving his blessings or used for sacramental anointing. And basically, it made all his acts as pope null and void. Then, for good measure, they take his body, throw it in the Tiber River. Find out a hermit living down the river is concerned, takes the body and gives it a proper burial. But what is most fascinating about this, Pope Stephen was the pope who organized the Cadaver Synod. But this was strange because he was ordained by Pope Formosus. And by cutting off those 3 fingers, He nullified his own ordination as a priest. So he will be deposed by the bishops, imprisoned, and ultimately strangled, as were other popes. And just to show you, this was craziness that you and I would not be accustomed to, but I want us to go back to the time period, the Dark Ages. We have monks writing in their cells. They're like the only educated group. Most of the people are just trying to survive. Subsistence agriculture. There's no leisure, no time for education. And where we left off, Henry III had become king of Germany. And we talked about those Ottos, and they were these terrible emperors. But they all wanted to go on that precedent that Pope Stephen, remember, blessed Pepin's monarchy. The Pope blessed Clovis's monarchy. So there's this understanding that a king has to rule by divine right. And there's that alliance then between church and state and how they understood the world. Well, unfortunately, this leads to some, shall we say, naughty practices. As bishops get more power and more control, going to see occasionally some of the priests may practice something called simony. And simony is literally the buying, you want to call it a spiritual commerce, the buying and or selling of sacraments or church offices. The buying and or selling of church sacraments or offices. We're asking the priests, though, to be not just spiritual pastors. We're asking them to be secular rulers. St. Jerome wrote in the 4th century, "Since the church has come under Christian emperors, it has indeed grown in power and wealth, but it has decreased in moral strength." How do you get that balance? Can the church use secular power without losing its moral power? Can the church use its secular power without losing moral power? And we see that is a discussion we still have today. I don't want you to think, though, the Middle Ages was terrible, that this buying or selling of sacraments, but priests were married. Priests had families. They had to provide for them. So maybe you charge fees for confession, baptism, funeral mass, but not a good thing, but understand it at least in its historical context. The next word up there is primogenitor. And primogenitor, if you look at the roots, means firstborn. And the custom in those days was that the firstborn child inherited everything. And if you look at today, the understanding is, most people would have, if parents die, they usually would divide their possessions equally among the children. So I'm one of 5 children. It's kind of anticipated 5 of us would inherit equal shares. Well, in the Middle Ages at this time, it was estimated a family needed at minimum 5 acres to survive. 5 acres to grow your corn, your wheat, vegetables. You need a little area for livestock. If you wanted a goat for milk, chickens, they needed a place to graze, to move around. If a parent was to divide 5 acres equally so that each child got 1 acre, you're pretty much guaranteeing each child to starve. So you give it all to the firstborn. What do you do with the rest? Well, if you're son number 1, you're okay. Those of you who are not son number 1, be a robber, a vagabond, or if your parents are crafty, maybe you have a sister. Maybe the local lord or maybe the bishop needs a concubine or, a a bride. A really crafty, shrewd parent could work 2-for-1 deal here, that not only does your daughter get well protected, you don't have to worry about her, she'll be well fed, but also you can get son number 2 or son number 3 to be an abbot, maybe of a monastery, maybe even a bishop, who knows. I hope you see that parents are not evil. The church has this problem not because people are looking to be deceitful, but it's a way of survival at this point in history. The problem is it's harmful, right, when people assume leadership in the church for reasons other than talent and a vocation, a religious calling. And this goes back to the conversation we had. What qualities make a good priest? What qualities make a good ruler? And then that last corruption is called nepotism. And that is a practice of giving family or friends jobs they're not qualified for. Hey, Uncle Luigi, you need a job? Vito, yeah. And all this leads to a lack of a lack of qualified bishops, a lack of commitment. And that's on that next slide there. It leads to not a lack of spiritual life among people, but a lack of leadership. And that will hurt the church as it goes forward there. If you go to the slide 11, there is a place in France that will try to change the church. And interesting, once again, it begins with a layperson. William the Good of Aquitaine. I always like those medieval names. He decides he needs to do something. He has no heir. Who will inherit his fortune? He's amassed a large amount of land and possessions, and apparently he committed a murder that was bothering him. It was bothering his conscience. He was weighing heavily upon him, and he wrote, "The riches of a man are the redemption of his soul. Pondering this, and desiring to provide for my own safety while I am able, it is necessary that from the temporal goods which have been conferred upon me, I should give some little portion for the gain of my soul." Almsgiving, right? Been looked upon as something we should all do, right? Especially today, looking at the world. How can I take care of my neighbor? How can I help them? Well, William of Aquitaine, obviously, don't know much about his murder, don't know what he did, but he felt guilty about it, so he decides to create and build a monastery and give the church all this land, this huge monastery. And probably the most important thing he does, the bishops can elect their own abbot. Think about that. Shocking. I say, Mr. Skak, why? How is that shocking? Well, remember monks could choose their own abbot in the beginning? Something happened. We don't know what. But suddenly, because of simony, nepotism, primogeniture, local kings are choosing the abbot. And William the Good of Aquitaine is genius here. They can choose their own abbot so they can go back to actually living like monks, to actually being religious. He also puts it under the authority of the Pope. Even though the Pope at this point might be corrupt, he's far away and has power so that the local king and bishop doesn't want to interfere. This will begin a renewal of a Benedictine order, and it's going to start a reform that Cluny will be a dominant force in the church for over 200 years. And you don't have to worry about slide 12, but slide 13 is most important. Because papal reform is going to come about because of Cluny. Cluny is going to produce such holy, spiritual, reform-minded, talented, educated individuals. They will be chosen as the next popes. And so we'll begin kind of this upward spiral of reforming and changing the papacy, the church. And it's going to begin with Henry III. If you remember, we left off in class a long time ago that there were 3 candidates, 3 Italian families, claiming that they had the right person to be the Pope. And basically, Henry is, I have in the slide there, he is a monk in worldly garb. Very spiritual man, sees himself as an Old Testament type king like David or Solomon. He wants to be blessed by the Pope, and he goes and sees these horrible, one of the candidates, I think, is a 12-year-old. So Henry is horrified by this and decides that he needs to dismiss all 3 candidates. He was going to Rome because he thought this was a sacrament. He thought coronation of a king, the blessing of a king by the Pope, was a holy event that God had blessed. He was ruling by divine right. God worked in him as God worked through a priest during Mass. So remember, somebody like Charlemagne, he had great intentions. He had a good heart. And he's horrified by finding these 3 candidates, so he dismisses all 3 and chooses a German who is reform-minded. He will take the name Clement II. Henry underestimates the Italian nobles, though, because Clement will die of poisoning within 2 months. So Henry chooses a second one, who takes the name Damasus, and he only lasts a few weeks. The next candidate in slide 15 is my hero, Leo IX. I mean, who wants a job after the 2 previous guys got poisoned? I mean, shoot me, don't mess with my food. But Leo IX will become in slide 15, he'll become our next and a major reform pope. And he's going to call something called synods. And synods are a nice word, S-Y-N-O-D, for a small meeting of bishops of a particular area, to discuss what are the problems, what are the concerns, what is the spiritual life like of a particular area. Not a worldwide council, but a localized area. Leo is going to identify, though, the biggest problem seems to be in the church, simony. And Leo is the one who will make a connection between simony and celibacy. He's going to promote celibacy, and the church needs holy bishops who don't have families to support. That way you don't resort to simony. We need more pious, and he's coming out of that monastic tradition that you don't need material goods, you don't need material possessions, and he's thinking that marriage, having a family, being a father, biological father, you get other worries and concerns. So he is our first pope that is really making this connection. Celibacy seems perfect on practical grounds then to avoid simony. He's also going to be our first pope that promotes what we would call a general reform. He's going to be traveling through France, Germany, and Italy, encouraging people, citing his authority as the Bishop of Rome. And he will condemn incest and divorce as well. And he's going to start the practice of sending people to represent him. Unfortunately, we're going to come back to Leo in our next class when we talk about the Eastern Church, because Leo, we have a guest now. She loves the story of Leo. This is Esther, Evie, sorry. Evie has a question for us today too. Evie, what's the question? Oh, she wants to know, do dogs go to heaven? Please type your answer. Look at Evie. Okay, Evie, you gotta sit here. Sorry about that. Because the Pope is a king, he leads an army, and he's going to actually get captured. But we're going to come back to him. The lay investiture controversy, what you read about for today. Leo begins what is called a Gregorian reform. So if you go to slide, slide 16, the lay investiture, we're talking about a feudal system here. And let's use it in modern terms. If I was king of New York City, let's pretend I'm not the Pope. There's no internet. There's limited travel. There's no cell phone. So how do I take control? So I'm going to take Queens because that's the best borough. But then I appoint people to be heads of each of the other boroughs. So I don't know Alonzo, you're going to get the Bronx, right? Let's see. Reese, you're in Staten Island. You need to be away from people, right? I don't know. But you see, like, I'm delegating authority. And in a sense, this is the feudal system. I am the lord. Reese is my vassal. But in Staten Island, they think he is the lord. And he is probably encouraging that. Because he probably wants his son to become the next king. And that's the challenge of feudalism. Do you have a hereditary dynasty, or do you continue this decentralization? Well, one of the kings figured out a way around this, saying that, well, the Pope has said that priests can't be married. So if I pick a bishop to be the head of Staten Island, instead of Reese, who is going to undermine me, well, suddenly he legally cannot have any heirs, and this is beneficial. The lay investiture part comes where I, as king, am investing him with his spiritual symbols. So not only am I giving him juridical power, but I'm giving him his crozier and his ring, the symbols of his office as spiritual shepherd. And that's a little bit of a problem. Like, does that look good? Remember we talked about Pope Leo and Charlemagne? Pope Leo crowning Charlemagne in front of everybody. The appearance being that Charlemagne was getting his power from the Pope. Well, now it looks like the church is getting its power from the king. And we're trying to figure out, well, what to do with this. Gregory, if we jump down to, well, in number 17, we also have to have this theory here, papal supremacy. This is the beginning of logic. It's basically, if A is true and B is true, therefore C. So in A, you see there, the king is supreme in secular matters. The Pope is supreme in spiritual matters, basically accepted. 2, spiritual matters are more important than secular. Again, at this point in history, accepted. Everybody accepts it. Draw the natural conclusion. The Pope is the highest power in the world. That sounds great. Except it has to be put into practice. And we're going to get a guy who will try to put it into practice, and his name will be Hildebrand. And we'll talk about him in our next session. Have a good day, guys. Any questions, please email me. Or, well, I guess that sounds best. But bye.